Yo, what's up, guys? Hope you guys like furniture, because we're going to be staring at a bunch of tables today. So, I've wanted to do a metagame report for a while now, but I also wanted to at least back up my takes on the meta with some actual data. So, I grinded a bunch of hardcore ladder across 3 accounts, and I actually almost have gotten my third one into the top 25 hardcore ranked leaderboard now. I started keeping track of all my stats around the 18th of March on stream, so the stats from this dataset is certified fresh. I'll just talk about most of the decks that I've been running in best of threes, and I'll give a metagame power ranking at the end of the video. Now, overall, I've maintained about a 64% win rate to my opponent's 36% win rates on hardcore ladder, and while some people may say this is an indicator of a skill gap, we're not that arrogant on this channel to think that we're better than our opponents. We're simply luckier at top decking, so I use my own luck measuring system called Statistical Karma Indicator for Luck and Losses, or SKILL for short, to explain the win rate gap between myself and my opponents. Anyways, the first thing we need to address is probably the elephant in the room, the play draw in Lorcana. A little over a month ago, Ryan Miller, one of the co-designers and brand managers of Lorcana, gave an interview, shout out to France by the way, and when talking about the play draw win rate disparity, he said internal testing team had shown a on the play win rate to only be favored at around 53%.
Yeah, so I mean, again, I can't talk much about the future. It's definitely something we've had our eye on. Our estimates are closer to 53%, and so we haven't seen the 60%, but our estimates are closer to that, which it's never great to feel like the game came up to a coin toss or something like that.
Now, every single top player will tell you that this is absolutely not the case, and in fact, this 53% number actually became a little bit of a meme in the community.
If you go first, and he was like, "Oh, I think our testing's kind of closer to 53%." Is what he said.
53.
Yeah.
What?
So
If any game designer wants to play me, and they think they can win
53 or
53% of the time.
43,
Yeah, if they can win 47 going second, then I will publicly apologize.
oh my god.
So, after about 250 games, my own personal data suggested that with an overall win rate of 64%, this number was a culmination of winning 75% on the play and 54% on the draw. That's around a 20% win rate differential attributed to the coin flip. And taking a look at the opposite side of the matchups, I've also included the stats from my opponent's perspective. So if I'm winning 64% of the time overall, then it makes sense that my opponents are winning 36% of the time. And this number becomes the culmination of my opponents winning 46% on the play and 25% on the draw. Again, showing a 20% win rate differential that can be attributed to the coin flip. And if you ask anyone who's played any significant amount of games in Lorcana, I'm sure they would all certainly agree that being on the play definitely feels more around 20% more favorable, like my numbers would indicate, than the around 6% favorability that was stated in Ryan's interview. Now, to Ravensburger's credit, as well as Ryan Miller, he did say it was an issue that they were going to keep an eye on, and I'm sure over time they'll come to realize how imbalanced this aspect of the game is. And in a way, their recent announcement for their organized play best of 2 formats might already be them acknowledging the play-draw balance issue in the game, and it's a temporary band-aid solution to the problem while they think about how to resolve this issue in long term. Play-draw imbalance is a topic I could probably rant about for hours, but maybe that's a topic for another video, so I won't talk about this any further here. Let's just go ahead and take a look at how the current meta is shaping up. So, Blue-Red is one of the most popular emerging decks in the format, and in fact was the second most popular deck played by my opponents. With the addition of Lucky Dimes, I think it can easily go toe-to-toe with Red-Purple, and possibly even be favored against it. It's also the natural counter of Blue Steel and Steel Song decks, as by playing blue, you're able to ramp up your ink count to capitalize on your resources after they cast a whole new world. However, many of the steel decks now are adjusting to an item-heavy meta and running copies of Benja and Rise of the Titans to really disrupt Blue's game plan to draw off of Hiram or ramp with Fishbones, so Blue-Red still has to put up quite a fight to win against the steel decks. Blue-Red is also very weak to aggro decks, and it performs extremely terrible against turn 1 Merfolk type decks. It can tech harder against aggro if it wants, with cards like Teeth and Grammatala, Queen of Hearts, and Rush Stitch, but this will all weaken its matchups against decks like Blue Steel or the Mirror Control matchups. However, we are in a quite heavy steel meta right now, so I don't expect aggro decks to be too popular. So I do think Red-Blue is well positioned in the meta, and both my performance with the deck as well as my opponent win percentages with the deck make it look like one of the stronger picks of the meta. Next, we're not really going to cover Blue-Purple, as I don't think it really exists significantly inside the meta. According to Ben Gibson, though, who had a great run on Blue-Purple in last TIA tournament, it has a great matchup against Red-Purple, but then again, I think Red-Purple has fallen off quite a bit from its high point, and there's a lot of decks that also have great matchups against Red-Purple, but we'll go ahead and talk about Red-Purple a bit later in the video. I did ran a few games on Blue-Purple, and it felt like a reasonable deck, but definitely felt like a deck that wants to be on the play and flops quite hard on the draw. Next up is Blue Steel, which is easily one of the contenders for best deck in the current metagame. Being Steel, it has great matchups into aggro decks, and its already great matchup into Red-Purple has felt even better with the addition of Lucky Dimes. It originally had a very bad matchup against Red-Blue, but again, Lucky Dime has made this matchup significantly better. As for the version that I've been personally running on ladder, I've also anticipated a item-heavy metagame, so I've teched my own version of Blue Steel to be quite anti-items, going on to even replace my Tragic Beasts for Hard-Headed Beasts and Benjas. But there's a lot of different ways to build Blue Steel given your expectation. Blue Steel used to be quite a bit favored against Steel Song in previous sets, but with Steel Song picking up the incredibly resilient Robin Hood and very disruptive Bare Necessities, I think the matchup is actually quite close, especially if Steel Song is also running their own Benjas. Now, before you all go and pick up Blue Steel for a tournament though, I will say something that I've said many times on stream. Blue Steel is an extremely punishing deck towards inexperienced pilots. Since set 1, I've probably played over 700 to 800 games on Blue Steel alone, and still didn't feel that confident in piloting the deck until very recently. You can make errors with other decks and still be okay, but if you make one small incorrect inking decision or mulligan error on Blue Steel, it'll probably cost you the game. So if you take a look at my opponent win rates on Blue Steel against me, they've not been too impressive for what should be one of the best decks in the format. I think that's largely attributed to either piloting error or piloting inexperience. But in the hands of a strong Blue Steel pilot, I think the deck is easily top 2, if not the best deck in the format, and there's a reason it has shown some incredible finishes in many of the largest online Lorcana tournaments since set 2, including 4 final showings of TIA events and 2 wins. It's also my highest win rate deck overall, and the deck I'd most likely be running for an event. But remember, get your reps and practice in with this deck if you're looking to pilot Blue Steel for yourself. Next up, I'll talk a little bit about Green Purple and Green Steel together. They're both decks that try to take the incredible utility offered by the Ursula packages and the explosive early game offered by Merfolk and Flynn Riders. Green Purple does quite well into Blue Red and Red Purple, but suffers against most Steel decks, with Steel Song and Green Steel probably being its 2 worst matchups. It's also a deck that has more polarizing results dependent on the coin flip, and gets punished much more severely for being on the draw and rewarded greatly for being on the play. Because I play mostly Steel decks on ladder, you can see how abysmal my opponent's performance is when they're on the draw with decks like Green Purple. And when I run Green Purple myself, I can't even seem to maintain a greater than 50% win rate on the draw. Green Steel is similar to Green Purple, although I do feel like it performs a little better into decks like Steel Song or Blue Steel, since it does have access to disruptive tools like Benja. But it does worse into decks like Red Purple, as it gets gassed out and outvalued by Red Purple's pure card draw and efficiency. Regardless of which green deck you want to play, both decks are very reliant on winning the coin flip to have good performances, as they want to be leaning heavily into the aggressive Merfolk openings into value with Ursula double swings. I also generally have preferred going heavier on the discard route with both decks and try to cheese out our bad matchups with cards like Lucifer. Next up, let's talk a little bit about red-purple. If any of you have caught my streams lately on Twitch, I seem to constantly go off on rants and tangents about how bad of a deck I think red-purple is in set 3. But honestly, most of that is a bit exaggerated. As much fun as I have trashing red-purple, I think red-purple is still a solid deck, but it's certainly not the dominant force it was in set 2. You might say, hey, your win rate with red-purple is actually really good at 68%. But remember, almost a third of my games are against other red-purple decks. If you exclude mirror matches, my red-purple performance is actually at a respectable but not overly impressive 60%. If you look at my opponent performance rates on red-purple against me, it's an incredibly pathetic 26%. Red-purple is a deck I'm more than happy to face with whatever I'm running, and I've called it the deck that basically goes 45 to 48% against everything in the metagame. It doesn't have any auto-loss matchups, but at the same time, it doesn't really beat much, as all the decks in the metagame are created with red-purple in mind and are built to beat red-purple. You could almost say that red-purple is a victim of a hostile environment that it created for itself. Blue decks have become faster and more explosive with the unanswerable Lucky Dimes. Green-purple decks generate lore faster with the Merfolk opens and can outvalue red-purple's card draw with Ursula Friends. I feel like the majority of red-purple builds in set 3 have also lost the edge that made them so powerful in set 2. Remember, set 2 was all about how to tech against Surfer Minis because they were such a fast and difficult to answer 2-lore generator. Now, many red-purple lists are cutting minis which slow red-purple down. It's adding more reactive cards like Maui's Fishhooks, and some lists are even playing up to 3 Pinocchios, and people have mostly cut out the 2-lore Lady Tremaines for the much lower pressure 1-lore Madame Medusa. It seems red-purple, by building so defensively, has cut out its higher pressure cards simply to react to a meta that has also gotten faster. So most of the times, red-purple just draw cards, gain a lore at a time, and then lose to a Lucky Dime or Flutes. I've personally felt that I found more success in a less reactive and more proactive approach trying to play cards like Surfer Mini, Jim Hawkins with a full set of locations, and increasing my high and low roll potentials, but ultimately, I think red-purple is not really a deck that I'd be wanting to play in a tournament to try and win first place, and it's also not a deck I fear facing in a tournament. In my opinion, red-purple feels like a reasonably solid deck that's more of a comfort pick for players who are scared of auto-loss matchups into the field. And for those of you who say red-purple is still putting up great numbers in set 3, I would argue that it's because it still is the most played deck and also has a large amount of skilled pilots playing it. And it puts up numbers still off of both volume and piloting skill into top 8s because of its survivorship. But I absolutely do not think red-purple is the highest performance expectation deck you can bring to a tournament. But of course, if red-purple is the deck that you love to play the most and are most comfortable piloting, then by all means bring it to a tournament. It will still do very well, especially if you don't know how to pilot the other decks. Now, moving on to purple steel, it's basically Jafar Wheel these days, and I still think the deck is solid. As for why I only have a 20% win rate on the draw with it, I have no idea, but that's absolutely destroying my performance rating on the deck. But on the other side of it, my opponents seem to have a very good win rate against me with Jafar being the second best performance deck of my opponents. So if we factor in both my underperformance with Jafar and my opponent's maybe overperformance with the deck, I'd say Jafar is still a viable contender in the meta, though not necessarily one of the top tier decks of the format. I think Jafar needs to build a little bit differently than before with cards like Fire the Cannons and Benja to address the Steel Song and item dominant meta, but it's definitely a fair deck capable of winning any matchups, and I still respect the power of Jafar if I'm facing off against one. I won't really get into purple yellow hyper aggro much. I'm not much of a hyper aggro player, and I really don't like the archetype, so I don't have any games personally on it. I think the deck is actually in a horrible spot right now with all the steel decks running around, and has a near 100% auto loss against Steel Song in particular. Bring this deck if you're just looking to ruin some poor red-blue player's day, but don't expect to win any tournaments with this in the current meta. Red-Yellow Mufasa, I think, has been an under-the-radar and underestimated deck since Set 2, and it's picking up quite a bit of popularity in Set 3. I think Mufasa decks might be favored on the play against almost every single relevant deck in the meta, but is significantly weaker on the draw. It's much more resilient to steel decks though compared to other coin flip reliant decks like green steel or green purple aggro. Not too much to say about Mufasa other than it's certainly capable of great performances, and definitely a contender to bring to a tournament if you're feeling like the coin flip gods will be on your side that day. Mufasa decks are actually my opponent's third highest win rate decks against me, so I've learned to pay my respects to the king and fear the lion, despite a lot of other players still thinking Mufasa decks are a bit of a meme. It's an absolutely legitimate and underrated contender in the metagame. Last and definitely far from least, we have Steel Song. I think this deck is at minimum tied with Blue Steel in contention for best deck in the metagame, and it probably is the best current deck in the meta. This deck accounts for most of my losses on ladder, and is the deck I dread seeing across from me more than any other deck. I also have a very good performance rate with this deck on ladder. I do think the best versions of Steel Song involve flutes, as flutes give it incredible reach against its supposed bad matchups like blue-red. With Robin Hood Shift and some versions even running Smee, the deck can go under the opponent and get to 20 lore even faster than before without allowing the opponent to even keep a single character on board. It's a deck that absolutely suffocates hyper aggro decks in the meta, and also with access to disruption cards like Benja and Bare Necessities, it can completely ruin control decks. Even with alleged counter decks like Blue Steel or Blue Red, I find myself not even having a winning record against Steel Song, and a Steel Song player going first who high rolls his draw is basically unbeatable. It's had incredible success in recent large field tournaments, including getting to the finals back-to-back in Tia's last two tournaments, and winning completely undefeated in the Atlanta 8K. And it's certain to be a deck that will only increase in popularity off its recent momentum. Okay, anyways, here's my power rankings for best decks in the meta. Feel free to trash talk my list in the comment section, and once again, thanks everyone for watching.